Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here to open this series. And what better topic to talk about than a topic that is sometimes dangerous, sometimes old-fashioned, sometimes obsolete, the topic of political progress. So tonight I'm going to talk about what I think it means, why we need it, and maybe also how we might make it. Progress is both a necessary and a dangerous idea. It's necessary if we're trying to improve the way things are, but it's also dangerous because often the pursuit of progress has given rise to narratives of colonial domination, civilizational superiority, and liberal paternalism. So in this lecture, I want to reflect on how we can both preserve progress, but also a more critical account of progress. How we can hold on to the idea, but avoid the mistakes that have been made. And I want to reflect on what a more appropriate conception of progress might look like. And I want to suggest that we make progress not when we approximate an ideal of justice that is always and already given to us, but when the political institutions that we construct reflect what we learn from the trials and the failures of the past. And to outline how these learning processes might take place, I want to think about the ideal of democracy in connection to a particular economic model, the dominant one, the liberal capitalist model, and a particular institutional framework, also the dominant one, the nation-state one. And I want to learn the question of progress and raise what it means by thinking about the historical failure of also alternatives to liberalism. In particular, the experiment with socialism that roughly half of the world engaged with in the previous century, including the part of the world from which I come from, Albania, and the failure of which condemned us to the idea that all we have is liberal capitalism, that there is no way of getting out of it, that there is nothing better on offer. And this was the famous end of history thesis, which, as was previously mentioned, gave the title to my book, Free Coming of Age at the End of History, as advanced by Francis Fukuyama, who suggested that with the end of the Cold War, the question of alternatives to liberalism had become an obsolete question. And when I decided to call the book Free Coming of Age at the End of History, there was a nod to Fukuyama that everyone will understand from this context that I have just mentioned. But another nod that was that in that very article in which Fukuyama talks about the end of history, at some point confronts an objection to this Hegelian thesis as history and liberal freedom in march in history. And at some point, the discussion becomes what do small countries like Albania, or as he says, Burundi, might have to say about the end of history. And in that book, he says at some point, well, we don't ask really the people of Albania what they think about this thesis. And when I read the article, I thought, well, maybe you should hear from the people of Albania as well. And that's why I titled the book Coming of Age at the End of History. But I also think that if we're serious about the concern that we have with the rise of authoritarianism, with criticisms to liberal society, with the rise of the far right, we need to reckon not just with those projects, but also with what those projects are responding to, and the limitations of also that liberal view that Fukuyama put forward and to which we were seemingly condemned after the end of the Cold War. So let me start with a general question. What do we mean and why do we need the idea of progress? And what does it mean to believe in progress? To answer that question, I think it helps to place that belief between two extreme opposites. On the one hand, we have the view that progress is not impossible. And that sounds plausible, but is also trivial, because the position becomes strong just because the alternative is weak. And what the alternative says is, well, progress is impossible. And of course, it's weak because it's a kind of prophetic theorizing about the future. It claims to know exactly what follows, and it claims to know that there will be no progress and that progress is impossible. So there isn't really any evidence, it's just a commitment. And then there's another extreme belief, which is that progress is necessary. And that's too strong, because in arguing that case, we seem to misunderstand who is responsible for making progress, who is the agent that commits to this idea of progress. And we also seem to forget that prophetic history of that kind, of that necessary claim about progress, is about human beings. And human beings are, yes, moral, and yes, they want to do the right thing, and yes, they are committed to the right ideals, but they're also flawed, and they also fight with what Kant called radical evil in them. And so we can't attribute to them a consistently good will, and if we were able to attribute to them this consistently good will, then perhaps we would be able to make progress necessarily, but since the will is not always good, progress is not always possible, and indeed not necessary. So the problem is that humans aren't exclusively moral, the motives of their actions are mixed, and it's very difficult to know in advance what might follow from people like that and from a species like ours. So to believe in progress is to say a little bit more than progress is not impossible, but it's to say a little bit less than progress is necessary. And here, I want to suggest that what we need to defend progress and the claim to progress is a shift in perspective. A shift in perspective that focuses on how humans express themselves through the social and political institutions they construct by examining those institutions, the political and social institutions, as they promote or hinder that moral agency. And so I think we need to explore history in this very old-fashioned way, which is history from a philosophical perspective, as if we were looking at a purposeful system that integrates moral motives and practical actions, but that also tries to reckon with the limitations of the human and with evil in the world. So, where do we start with this new philosophy of history? Well, for obvious reasons, in my work, I've tried to think about history from two perspectives. One is microhistory, and the other one is macrohistory. So microhistory is about the book that was just mentioned, about Free, about how history, with a capital H, shapes and conditions the lives of people like me, who grew up in Albania in the transition from communism, like my family, who experienced these transitions, and how the existing institutions that they lived under failed to promote the ideals that they were committed. And I also want to focus on macro history, on the history of laws and states and the rules we make and the rules that we are all committed to. One of my long-standing convictions is that actually this kind of philosophical history is at the center of these two projects that have been seen as contenders to each other historically. Liberal projects on the one hand and socialist project on the other. And so I'm interested with these two different kinds of failures, with the failures of both of these projects and what we are to make of them, while still remaining committed to this idea of progress and while still holding on to some glimmer of hope that humans are moral and they do want to make moral progress. And it's just a question of figuring out how to eliminate the obstacles that they encounter on the way to making progress. And so, again, one of my convictions has been that while a lot of people think of both socialism and liberalism as political antagonists, as one committed to freedom and the other one committed to equality, in reality there is something that animates both of these traditions as they emerge from modernity, and that's to say the concern with freedom. And so socialist freedom isn't really an alternative or rather an elimination of liberal freedom, is an attempt to make that freedom more robust and to engage with the conflicts and the exclusions that that conception of freedom leaves out. So it radicalizes these conceptions of freedom even further, and it explains that they're not for particular categories of people, they're not just for some social classes and not for others, they're not just for some states and not for others, they're not just for some individuals but also for others. So the other, going back to the microhistory, that's the macro perspective, going back to the microhistory, I think it's important not to engage with liberalism and socialism as just systems of thought. And so if we want to think about progress as a process of learning from the errors of the past, well, that means to analyze failure in the way that doesn't just separate the historical experience of people who lived under these systems from the defense of the ideas, from the philosophical justification of the systems themselves. And so often in normative political theory, which is what I've been working on until now, people engage with ideas as just ideas, and in fact, sometimes it's also a defense. They say, well, it's just an idea, but ideas actually shape lives and change lives and constrain lives and sometimes create tragedies in people's lives. And so we can't afford not to reflect about how ideas become politics, become humanity, how macro history becomes micro-history. And we can't also afford not to raise the question of how does freedom as an ideal distinguish itself from freedom as an ideology, as the kinds of slogans and rules that people are told to believe in and to conduct their behavior by and to think about in their daily lives. So how can we distinguish between freedom as an ideology and freedom as a set of political slogans, as an ideology, as an ideal and as an ideology? And the suggestion is to start thinking about contradictions in the experience of freedom, the tension between the moral ideals that we are committed to and the interpretation of these ideals by existing institutions. So just to give you a very simple example, think about freedom of movement. I remember the first time I traveled from communist Albania into the West, into Greece, with my grandmother, and I was about 11-year-old, and I had never been outside Albania. Albanians weren't allowed to travel outside Albania. If they did try to travel, they would be shot at the border. And we didn't have a passport, and we were told, and the state didn't give passports to anyone, it just gave them to officials who needed to travel, party bureaucrats or members of the elite. And we were told, well, we can't travel because we don't have a passport. So at some point, the wall came down, the Cold War ended, and the Albanian state started handing over passports to everyone. So me and my grandmother wanted to go to Greece and discovered that finally we had this piece of paper, which I didn't even know existed up to that point. I'd never seen one in my life that was called a passport. And so I thought we could travel. And my grandmother explained, well, actually, it's not just the passport that you need, you also need a visa. No one had told me that you also needed a visa to travel abroad. I thought the problem was the Albanian state that wasn't handing over passports to people, and now that the Albanian state was giving the passport, it wasn't clear to me why not every Albanian who had a passport couldn't go wherever they wanted to go now that they had this passport. And so overnight, the discourse shifted, and all the impediments to freedom of movement that we had internalized up to that point became externalized. It was no longer a question of your own state that didn't let you get out. It was a question of other states that didn't enable you to come in. And that was one of my first times of thinking about the contradictions of freedom and about the difference between freedom as an ideal and freedom as an ideology. You're told that you should be free, that there is freedom of movement, and that a state that punishes people for their desire to leave, for their moving abroad, is a criminal state. And the state, your state, is no longer that criminal state. So now you're encountered with these other states who all seemingly behave in criminal ways, but somehow it doesn't bother anyone. And the question was, well, if freedom of movement matters, surely it matters both in entrance and in exit. It matters both in the case of emigration and in the case of immigration, both to leave your country and to enter another country. So if I'm told I'm free to leave this lecture room, but then all the other, well, this one leads into the open space, so it's not a good example, but all the other doors outside and the city of Basel is locked and I can't leave the city of Basel, then what really is my freedom of movement worth? And is it really freedom of movement? Or is it just a discourse, an ideological discourse that I have been given to enable me to condemn my state for not letting me out, but then to suspend my criticism of all these other states who are not letting me in? So I think the idea that we can simply close borders and you can realize freedom in one place, in one state, or in a group of states, for only one group of people but not for others, is just an incoherent idea if you think about the ideal of freedom of movement. So we need to think about freedom as global freedom, and we need to think about democracy as global democracy. So how do we do that? I think the crisis of democracy that we are experiencing has brought to light a kind of curious tension, because on the one hand, it has challenged globalization theories that diagnosed, up to the early 90s, the death of the state, or sometimes celebrated the death of the state, depending on the point of view. And on the other hand, it has shown us this gap between the ideology of the state and the ideal of the state as protective of people's freedom. The notion that we subject to the state because we are all authors of the laws that we want to be subjected to. And that's because the modern conception of democracy is a very distinct type of legitimation from other alternative accounts that existed up to that point, different from the ancient model where community was the source of moral norms, different from the medieval to the early modern period where authority came from the divine right of kings. The modern conception of legitimacy and of democracy is tightly connected to freedom. And it's invoked to explain why individuals who are born free and equal accept to be subjected to these authorities, like the state, in exchange for a greater realization of their freedom. So the idea of democratic legitimation, this connection that we have with political institutions, this suspension of our own individual freedom for the greater freedom that the community gives us, is exactly what explains why it's the state and the state only that can declare emergencies and no one else. No other institution has the same capacity to declare an emergency and to tell us you stop moving, you stay in lockdown, you don't take your children out in the park and so on. Because only the state is there to protect freedom. The freedom to move, the freedom to associate with others, or the freedom to vote in elections. Now, most of these freedoms are, in theory, guaranteed in all the founding documents of the liberal constitutional democracies that we know. But we also know that most or all of them have been suspended as part of the various emergency measures in the different crises that we have gone through in the last few years, from health emergency to financial emergency to war. And so this suspension of democratic norms by the state is invoked in the name of what the state does to promote this higher order freedom that we all have, in the name of this contractual relationship that we have to the state. We decide to stand back, the state takes over. We decide to stand back because the freedom that we get in community with others is greater than the freedom that we have if we're just by ourselves and fighting for ourselves. So that explains why we returned to sovereignty in theory, and we also returned to sovereignty in practice. But the idea that we all share the same threats and that we are all equal to the laws that we make has actually also looked increasingly like just a rhetorical device that political elites used to persuade people for doing certain things, but without really robust justification and really without giving all of them the same back in return. So just to give you an example, in the same week in which 22 million Americans lost their jobs, US billionaire wealth rose by almost 10%. This was during the pandemic. Or in the UK, black people were 4 times more likely to die than white people. During the quarantine, as you probably know, domestic violence rose significantly, and indeed that's where the term intimate terrorism was used. And the attainment gap of children who stayed at home compared to children who could go to school or who had families of middle-class background who could educate them widened, and a number of other statistical long-term psychological consequences of the pandemic were much more severe on people who had anxiety and depression and who were coming from poor backgrounds. And that's without even going to the question that troubled the country that I came from, Albania, which was access to vaccines, where you had people literally dying while Western capitalist, strong, wealthy states were hoarding vaccines for the 15th wave of the pandemic, when there were literally people dying just on their doorstep. So liberal society is not a society that is free from fear. And in some ways, the fear that it brings is worse than the fear from the state of nature that people had when they thought about we need the state and we need this relationship to the state to be protected from our fears. Because in a way, in the state of nature, at least that lawlessness, that fear, is equally divided. And Hobbes' famous metaphor that, the weakest person can be a danger to the strongest person is true of the state of nature, but is not true of the states that we have. So that's, in the civilized condition, in some ways that relationship gets worse, because while we take for granted our duty of obedience to the state, there are huge discrepancies in the way in which states protect the people who are subjected to them. And so we're all asked to make the same sacrifices, but institutions don't take the same responsibilities for all of us. Now, I focus on emergency because emergencies are usually this short-term phenomena through which something important about our condition is signaled for the long term. And so the political and the economic and the social crises that lie at the heart of the phenomena are there and are there to stay for the long term, and together they amount to a crisis of the system. But whether you see it as a crisis of a system or whether you see it as an ad hoc phenomenon, in turn depends on what kind of ideological glasses you're wearing. So if you're wearing the glasses that try and focus your mind on the difference between the freedom as an ideal and the freedom as an ideology, you'd be much more critical. And if you don't have those kinds of glasses, well, you think this is emergency, this is what the state is telling me to do, and this is what I need to do to comply. So the threat to the civil condition isn't just the kind of crisis that we face, but the condition of permanent emergency that legitimizes certain authorities while suspending our capacity to judge critically these authorities. And so emergency rule is dangerous because it sets a precedent for giving up on democracy and for handing over power to a few people, the elites, the technocratic experts, the people who control data agencies, the economic wealthy business classes, all those institutions that demand compliance from everyone, but actually offer protection only to some. So if we don't think the foundations, if we don't rethink the foundations of the social contract, if we don't rethink how does freedom as a moral ideal connect to freedom as an institutional practice, the relationship of individuals to their institutions will break down, and so the state will lose its authority, and representative democracy will lose its function as the mechanism through which that authority can become legitimate. So the state will become, as in the famous saying, the monopoly over the use of force, but it will not have legitimate authority. So that's why the question of political progress is connected to the question of rethinking the foundations of democracy in light of these historical experiences. And this is where I think we need to take stock from both the failures of the East and the failures of the West, both the failures of socialism and the failures of liberalism. The failure of socialism in Eastern Europe has taught us that some quintessentially liberal freedoms, the freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of thought, freedom of protest, freedom of movement shouldn't really be negotiable, that you can't sacrifice those to a higher vision of the community. But on the other hand, these first-generation freedoms need to be coupled with robust guarantees under which they become effective and under which you can really realize people's moral potential. So what does it mean to say you have freedom of thought when you don't have access to culture? Or what does it mean to say that all our thoughts are, we can associate with other and we can exchange political debate when our political opinions are disciplined by data controlling agencies or flow through private algorithms that enable corporations to make profit? So it seems to me the meaningful engagement with the question of freedom requires rethinking the foundations of democracy. And to that end, rethinking the foundations of democracy means winding back and thinking about the compatibility between freedom, between liberalism and capitalism as both historical phenomena and as moral ideals. So this is where I want to take a few minutes just to reflect on this historical experience of coupling liberalism with capitalism and trying to explain that I think there are many more contradictions there than we acknowledge usually, and many more contradictions that if we were to register would push us in a much more critical direction, and I think in a direction of a critique to capitalism. So liberalism is a broad church, and liberalism is not the same as capitalism. Capitalism is a set of economic and political relations. Liberalism is a set of ideas. And while capitalism wouldn't be capitalism without the support of these liberal ideas, not all liberal theories support capitalism. So you can think of people like John Stuart Mill or John Rawls, who are critics of capitalism or indeed reflect and write on alternative forms of social organization like property owning democracy and so on. So this puts liberalism in a curious position, and my own slogan is that socialism is liberalism minus capitalism. But to the extent that liberalism travels with capitalism, it's a historical phenomenon. To the extent that it departs from it or it qualifies it, it's a social ideal, and indeed the social ideal of socialism. Liberalism has a core idea, which is freedom, and it has this core promise, as we said, freedom from fear. And for progressive liberals, the question is, should the failure of capitalism be considered a failure of liberalism? And if we understand liberalism just as an ideal rather than the reality under which we live, to what extent can we make sense of these weird phenomena that we encounter on the way, so the encounters between capitalism and socialism, capitalism and fascism, fascism and theocracy, populism, and so on. So, as I see it, liberalism can't deliver freedom from fear with capitalism, because liberal societies, in their encounter historically with capitalist economic structures, produce pathologies of their own that reproduce fear rather than eliminating that. And to see that, I want to focus on three elements of this historical encounter between liberalism and capitalism. So, and to explain the tensions, I want to go not to Marx and not to alternatives of criticism to liberalism, but refer to liberal authors who themselves saw the contradictions in the project and themselves saw the tensions in this encounter between liberalism and capitalism. Intellectual origins of the project are in the wars of religion of the 16th and 17th century, and there is a combination of these three elements, each of which I want to say something briefly about. First is a moral anthropology, the second is the theory of economic institutions, and the third one is the theory of politics. And all three of them, and the combination between them, helped liberal visionaries articulate this account of what is power and how can you legitimize power and what does it mean to resolve this freedom from fear. They contributed to this liberal utopia that we're still waiting to realize. But on all of these accounts, on the anthropology, on the economics, and on the political level, all the early critics of liberalism had pointed out the tensions between liberalism as a set of ideals and liberalism as an encounter with these historical phenomena. So let me start with the anthropology of liberalism. Many people approved the liberation of individuals. Indeed, Marx was one of them. In the Communist Manifesto, those of you who have read it will know that it starts, before it becomes critical of capitalism, it has these pages in which it goes on about how great capitalism is and how great the bourgeoisie is and how it's turned down all these Chinese walls and so on. And that's because it celebrates the emergence of a new ideal, that is to say, the ideal of civil society. And this was based on the role of commerce, the doux commerce, as Montesquieu called it, and the overall contribution to trade to material prosperity and the peaceful relations between human beings. But with the celebration of the centrality of the individual, so the discourse that private vices become public virtues, that each of us pursues their own individual interest, but there is a larger good that emerges from just this individualized pursuit, there was also a list of destructive psychological dispositions that were set in motion by this very process of the expansion of trade. And Rousseau, who was one of the early critics of the project, mentioned just some. It encouraged selfishness, it encouraged greed, it encouraged envy, it encouraged distrust, it encouraged competition for inessential and luxury goods, it encouraged exaggeration of appearances, the desire to impress, the desire for external recognition, indifference to the fate of people who are more vulnerable, and so on and so forth. And all of these pathologies you will be familiar with because they are all the pathologies of the societies that we still live under. So that's the moral anthropology. That's why it's hard for liberalism to deliver from fear in this capitalist variation, because it has this moral psychology that is destructive of the human instincts that we might also have to cooperate with others. Now, take the relationship between the economic theory and the theory of the state. So again, a lot of early liberals celebrated commercial society, but on the other hand, they also needed the state to guarantee its functioning. So liberals credit themselves with the invention of human rights and the universal ideal of citizenship. They credit themselves with the end of corporate representation and the idea that the individual represents themselves. These first-generation freedoms that I mentioned that were missing in the socialist world are exactly part of that important legacy. But this ideal was constantly threatened by the conflict between the demands of the market, of commercial society, on the one hand, and the demands of the other, of the state on the other. So on the one hand, the state is necessary to guarantee certain rights and obligations that enable the commercial society trade to function. On the other hand, the state has very few revenues of its own, and so it needs to get its income from taxation by relying on resources that the markets allocate. And so this, as again, a number of early critics of liberalism noticed, the state relies on taxation and the contribution that the rich make to its finances in order to preserve order, but depending on taxation and welfare measures necessary to ensure that inequality doesn't threaten stability, this can be so divisive as to destroy the idea of civic solidarity that is required for the state to function. So in other words, the market undoes what the state tries to do. And this was also part of the story that I tell in the second half of my memoir, where I look at how shock therapy, liberal reforms, marketization of Albanian society destroyed all the solidaristic structures that were not marketized, that were not for profit, the voluntary organizations that people had, through which they were coping with scarcity and with hardship. And so, far from ending war, as this thesis of commercial peace claimed, what it did is encourage rivalry, and it took, because each state was in competition to try and guarantee and to have the resources that the market gave, the states were in competition with each other, and so the antagonism was taken from the domestic sphere to the international one. And what you have is this rivalry of a different kind. So rivalry now not between individuals in the state of nature, but between states in the global society. And that's also why Fichte, who was one of the most acute observers of this dynamic in the 18th century, was defending the closed commercial state as a solution to this tension between the state on the one hand and the global market on the other, and indeed ended up opposing to the totalitarianism of the market, the totalitarianism of the state, and indeed was the model, I think, that inspired many of these real-world socialist experiences that I have begun my life with, unfortunately. So that leads to a third source of fear that is, again, distinctive of this encounter between liberalism and capitalism. Classical liberals tried to celebrate the role of the state, but also celebrated the role of civil society as this spontaneous, non-hierarchical structure where everyone is equal. And this celebration was part of a stage theory of history where you have hierarchies between types of civilization. So you start with hunter-gathering, then you have pastoral, then you have agricultural, and then you have the superiority of commercial society. That's the final stage. And this, socialists are often criticized for endorsing teleologies of history and so on. But this, again, was one of its own making. It was socialist theorists who reflect on criticisms of liberalism. That's the one part that they don't really depart from liberalism, is in endorsing this kind of philosophy of history, which is also the one that I was trying to move away from at the beginning of my talk, and where I said it's connected to a narrative of progress that is dangerous and paternalistic, and so on. This was inherently hierarchical, and the price of liberal hope in the triumph of civil society was to condemn alternative forms of life, hunter-gathering and agricultural, as inferior stages of development, as primitive as backward. So here, too, liberalism produces its own distinctive fear, which is the fear of colonialism and imperial domination. And that is not a collateral damage. It's not an inconsistent application of the liberal norms. It's what results from the combination of ideals of freedom with their application to a capitalist structure that celebrates a particular type of interaction between individuals. So it's a kind of crucial component of this liberal mission to bring the virtues of civil society to people who are otherwise unable to realize them. So liberals often brush aside the history of colonialism as if this was nothing to do with the ideals, and don't realize how, without this intrinsic connection between the utopia of expansion of capitalist societies on the one hand and liberalism's civilizing mission, you don't understand how even critics of these societies like Tocqueville and Mill and so on, who didn't really necessarily condone everything that capitalism had to bring, were in the end okay with killing barbarians and civilizing them, and why a number of authors, including my dear Kant, were not as critical as colonialism and as imperialism as we would like them to be, because they were the result of this particular project. So the fear of colonialism, and related to that of neo-colonialism that comes in the form, in our days, in the form of debt dependency or of subservience to international institutions that are hegemonized by Western liberal countries, or of humanitarian intervention, isn't an unfortunate byproduct of that historical development, is the result of a theory of history in which the liberal capitalist society is the final stage of a process that culminates in liberating these backward people from their stupidity and from their oppression. So all of this speaks to the general question concerning the liberal understanding of freedom and its relationship to power, and to the extent that liberals try to limit the power of the state or of religious authorities or of any collective organization that threaten individual freedom, they disperse power. But in the effort to disperse power, the project generates its distinctive power structures, its own set of fears, and its own kind of unfreedom. And so liberal power structures end up being anonymized rather than personal. They are spontaneous rather than planned, as in socialist Albania. The psychological attitudes that they deliver aren't spying and surveillance, but selfishness and indifference. So not outright aggression, just passivity and not caring about the plight of other people. But that doesn't mean that the fear of liberal capitalism is any less concerning or any less pervasive than the fears that the liberalist project seeks to abolish. If anything, it's more pernicious, because where power is dispersed, it's spontaneous and anonymized, it becomes particularly difficult to fight. So I'll just have to skip some part of my paper. What I wanted to say to wrap up all this is to say that in the end, ideas never materialize as they appear in the books. They always emerge and they always evolve with complex political and historical context, and they're shaped by specific circumstances. And what matters is how individuals interpret and make sense of these circumstances, but also how they exercise agency within them. So the outcome is often influenced by factors beyond their control, but there are also instances in which there is some degree of choice. So what do we need to do to reconcile, and this goes back to where I started with this idea of progress, where do we need to go back to reconcile both the presence of will in history and the absence of completely free will? What we need is a way of reflecting on how people can change the material circumstances under which they live. And what we need for that further is to approach history in this philosophical way. So we need to develop an analysis of history that helps us understand what counts as progress and discern progressive from regressive political movements in the public sphere. And while philosophies of history have often served as justifications for the status quo or for dominant ideas which themselves have this oppressive character, to make sense of action oriented towards the future, it's essential to have this philosophical understanding of history. It's essential to have this distinction between freedom as an ideal and freedom as an ideology. And so it's also essential to have a view of progress as learning from the trials and failures and successes of the past. So progress in this context involves working to refine principles of justice, societal perspectives, and democratic ideals that take the whole world and not just one individual, one country, one group of states as the unit of concern. So progress is, and that's why I said I was going to be old-fashioned, progress is, as what in the Enlightenment tradition people said, the process of emergence from our own self-incurred immaturity, from the dogmas of tradition, of state-centric culture, of perceptions about the immutability of the market, and yes, also from entrenched identity politics. But I also agree with Marx that the economy and prevailing political and economic power dynamics influence cultural patterns and trends. Certain views become dominant because they serve the interests of particular elites. So how does change happen? How does progress occur? I will leave you with this ambiguity in which I find myself. On the one hand, I believe in this project of the Enlightenment as the intellectual work of critique, of highlighting double standards, and of pointing out the contradictions between this ideal of freedom and the institutional reality. I also think that freedom is connected to moral agency. It's neither the freedom of the long-gone socialist world, nor the freedom of the struggling, agonizing capitalist world, but an awareness of our moral responsibility and of the types of institutions that we need to be able to challenge and to channel that responsibility. So the duty to engage with the problematic legacy of the past on the one hand, but also to acknowledge what we owe future generations in a way that promotes this moral world that is very far from the immoral world in which we live. On the other hand, that was one horn of the dilemma. I said I believe in the Enlightenment, I'm an idealist, I think morality is very important. On the other hand, I'm a materialist. I also think that we live in a world of injustice that is replicated by anonymous social structures, where the institutions that we have reflect dominant patterns of power relations, both within the state, but also between states, between the kind of core advanced capitalist West and other countries on the periphery. So if we don't collectively change the material incentives, it's not very clear how much scope and how much space there is for intellectual work to just raise consciousness and to open up this way to achieve the Enlightenment as we would like to. If we don't transform political institutions, and so if we don't take the critique of the ideas into the critique of the material political world, there will always be a gap between how the world appears to us and how it should be. And I think, morally speaking, a world that is made of asymmetries in the distribution of power, or in the distribution of opportunities, or in the distribution of the freedom to move, or in the distribution of material resources, or in the distribution of knowledge and the production of knowledge, that world is not a free world. And a world in which not everyone is free is a world that can't really be truly free for any one of us. Thank you.